It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where you just want to relax by the pool and enjoy some peace. I had my favorite drink in hand, soaking up the sunshine in my own backyard. Everything seemed perfect, until I noticed a figure peeking through the fence. A few moments later, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Confused, I looked around, wondering if there was an emergency nearby. To my shock, the police arrived at my gate, and my neighbor was pointing straight at me, shouting accusations. I couldn't believe what was happening. How could I be in trouble for simply enjoying my own pool? As the officers approached, questions raced through my mind. What did my neighbors say? Why would they do this? What unfolded next was something I never saw coming, and it changed more than just that day. It changed everything. The officers walked up calmly, but their serious expressions told me this wasn't a casual visit. One of them asked, "Are you the homeowner here?" I nodded, still in disbelief. My neighbor, standing just behind the gate, interjected, "That's not true. They don't belong here." I tried to explain, pointing out my ID and even offering to show proof that this was my property. But before I could finish, the officer held up his hand, signaling me to stop. He wanted to hear both sides of the story, and that's when my neighbor started unloading a series of wild claims. They insisted I had no right to be there and accused me of things that didn't even make sense. As I stood there, watching this unfold, I couldn't help but wonder, why were they doing this? Was this personal, or was there something deeper going on? The tension kept building, and I could feel the situation spiraling. As the officers listened to my neighbor rant, I stood there trying to stay calm, but inside I was fuming. None of what they were saying was true. They claimed I'd been trespassing, throwing loud parties, and even causing damage to the neighborhood. I couldn't believe it. I'd lived here for years, always kept to myself, and never caused trouble. Why were they so determined to make me out to be the bad guy? The officers turned to me and asked if I had anything to say. I explained that this was my home, my pool, and that I had no idea why my neighbor would accuse me of such things. But I could tell by the look on one officer's face that they weren't fully convinced yet. What made this worse was the way my neighbor kept looking at me, like this wasn't just about the pool. It felt personal. Had I unknowingly done something to upset them? Or was there more to this story than I realized? Every answer only seemed to lead to more questions. The officers decided to step inside to assess the situation. I walked them to the pool area, pointing out family photos hanging on the walls and even mail with my name on it. But my neighbor wouldn't back down. They kept yelling from the gate, insisting I was lying, that the house had been empty for years and I must have snuck in. Their voice was full of conviction, almost as if they believed their own story. One officer asked my neighbor to step back and calm down, but it was clear it wasn't going to be that simple. Meanwhile, I kept racking my brain. Why were they so adamant? Was this some misunderstanding, or were they deliberately trying to get me in trouble? Then, out of nowhere, my neighbor pulled out a phone, claiming they had evidence to prove their story. My stomach sank. What could they possibly have? The officers exchanged glances, tension thick in the air as we all waited to see what this so-called proof would reveal. My neighbor fumbled with their phone, scrolling furiously as they muttered about showing them the truth. The officers stood waiting, their patience starting to thin. Finally, they thrust the phone forward, showing a shaky video. At first glance, it looked like someone sneaking around a backyard. My backyard. I couldn't believe it. The video was dark and grainy, but the figure in it wasn't me. "See," my neighbor exclaimed, their voice sharp. "That's who's been living here. They come and go at night, like squatters." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who was in that video? The officers were now intrigued, replaying the footage and glancing at me for an explanation. I had none. This wasn't me, but it was my property. Could someone else have been here without my knowledge? The accusations were spinning out of control. I could feel the officers' doubt creeping in, and for the first time, I began questioning what was really happening. Just as the tension hit its peak, One of the officers paused the video and zoomed in on the figure. They studied it carefully, then turned to me and asked, "Do you recognize this person?" I shook my head, still confused and frustrated. But then something about the figure's stance, the height, struck me as oddly familiar. It wasn't until the officer played the video again that it clicked. The person in the footage wasn't sneaking. It looked like they were checking the pool equipment. I suddenly remembered hiring a maintenance worker a few weeks ago and my pool's filter had issues. The pieces started falling into place. I quickly found the worker's receipt on my phone and showed it to the officers. The officer compared the name on the receipt to the video and nodded. It wasn't me in the video, it was the worker doing their job. But just as relief began to settle in, the twist came. The neighbor hesitated, then confessed. They had seen the worker multiple times and assumed I was hiding something. Their complaints were less about suspicion and more about jealousy. Turns out, they'd been upset about a property dispute and wanted to make things difficult for me. The officers left with a warning for the neighbor to stop making false claims. As I stood by the pool, watching them leave, I couldn't believe how a simple day had turned into chaos. But at least now, I knew who I was dealing with, and I'd be ready if it ever happened again. As the situation finally settled, I stood there reflecting on everything that had just happened. What started as a peaceful day by the pool turned into a whirlwind of accusations, misunderstandings, and unexpected revelations. I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that the truth came out and frustration that it even got to this point. The officers reassured me they'd documented the incident and would step in if the neighbor caused any more trouble. As for my neighbor, they muttered a half-hearted apology before walking away, but I could see the tension wasn't completely gone. I decided I wouldn't let their actions ruin my peace. That evening, as I sat by the pool again, I realized something important. No matter how absurd or stressful things get, staying calm and standing your ground can make all the difference. It was a lesson I wouldn't forget.